Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of our 2021 Public Affairs programs. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Inspired by the United States Constitution and the history, the values, and the spirit of the Union League of Philadelphia, the foundation's goal is to create more informed, better citizen leaders. We do this through a host of programs, including programs like tonight's Public Affairs, but also through lots of lectures, exhibits. We care for a wonderful Civil War collection at the Heritage Center. We do citizen education for high school and college students, and a host of other programs throughout the year. And if anyone was in doubt that this kind of education and civics is needed, I think I would hope that last week's events and violence in Washington allayed any doubts that what we do is vitally important. And what we do is made possible through the generosity of League members and others who share our values. I want to especially thank the Founders Circle and Lincoln leaders who have really been our leaders in making all that we do possible. Tonight's program will run about an hour long. We will have a question and answer period of that towards the end. We'll get to as many questions as we can, and to ask a question, just use the Q&A function on your Zoom app, and you can ask questions at any time during the program. Our moderator tonight is the second woman member of the Union League of Philadelphia. She's well known to many of you. She is a great civic leader in her own right. And we're thrilled that she's with us this evening to moderate this great panel. Please welcome a former senator from state senator from New Jersey, Diane Allen. Diane.
Thank you very much. We're going to be talking about making Philadelphia competitive again. When you think about it, in this era that we're in, there's a lot that's gone on and our city has suffered. So we're looking at what can we do to make our city come back in a post-pandemic era. We have two great people who are going to be discussing it tonight. One of them is Terry Tracy. He's the CEO of Broad and Liberty, and that's a nonprofit media organization and public policy think tank. It's pretty exciting when you think about it. They're looking to improve civil dialogue, and that's absolutely what we need to do. He comes by way of Ralph Lauren and Gap, interesting background, and also politics in the city of Philadelphia. He's in the public policy world now and making a difference. Also is Larry Platt. Larry's co-founder and editor of the Philadelphia Citizen, and he arrives by way of being an editor of the Philadelphia Daily News, Philadelphia Magazine. He's also written several books, written for many other magazines, and he too cares desperately about our city. So we're in a city where no matter where you live, whether it's outside of the Philadelphia bounds in Pennsylvania or it's Delaware or New Jersey, this is the city we all love. When we talk about the city, we're talking about Philadelphia. The problem is, I believe that Philadelphia no longer loves us back. And we need to find a way to change that. And that's what we hope to do tonight. Larry, let me start with you and let me ask you what you think the one or two biggest issues are that we should concentrate on if we're going to succeed in bringing Philly back.
Well, Diane, first of all, thank you. And thank you to the Legacy Foundation and the Union League for inviting me to this exciting discussion. It's great to be back with you, Diane, and with Terry, my co-conspirator in speaking truth to power. I think there are a couple things from my perspective that we need to focus on. And one is almost philosophical, which is widening the lens, the aperture of the lens of what problem solving is in Philadelphia. You know, at Citizen, we just did our annual Ideas We Should Steal Festival. One of the panels I moderated was with three young mayors, Savanti Myrick, 39 years old in Ithaca, New York, Paige Cognetti, 39 years old in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Randall Woodfin, 35 years old, I believe, in Birmingham, Alabama. And Myrick had this great line that I have since stolen, which is, he said, there are three political parties in America. Democrats, Republicans, and mayors. And it's true that that cities have become a laboratory for innovation in practical problem solving. Not so much here, however. We're still stuck in an old political machine model that sort of subverts the common good to the private interest. And so the big takeaway for me is I think we need to widen the aperture of our lens about what problem solving is for the common good. And for me, that involves focusing on economic growth. I've become much more than ever an economic determinist, and a job is a wonderful solution to a number of the problems that ail us. Yes, our 25% poverty rate is worst in the nation, is an abomination. 499 murders, worst in the nation. We should be absolutely ashamed. But I think the most embarrassing statistic is that in a city that is 44% African American, only 2.5% of businesses are owned by African Americans, and that number jumps to 6% if you count sole proprietors. But businesses with payrolls, 2.5%. And there's no plan for addressing that. And if we don't address that, we are going to be submerged in a sea of inequity. So for me, those are the stakes.
All right, Kay, what do you think?
Well, I just want to first echo Larry's sentiments. Thank you to John and the Legacy Foundation, Senator Allen. It's delightful to be here with you tonight. And Larry, thanks for giving us a little elbow space in your nonprofit journalism ecosystem. We appreciate it. I agree with Larry in many regards. I would add a couple of key points. I think that in too many instances, former Speaker Tip O'Neill wouldn't believe it, right? It used to be that all politics was local. Now all politics has become national. And the nationalization of our local politics, I think, has left us in a place where nobody is really guarding the home front. And I would also argue that too often we have compromised functionality, the functionality of government, particularly at the local level, in the interest of ideological pursuits, using the mechanisms of local government to pursue policy aims that frankly probably wouldn't pass in Washington or Harrisburg, irrespective of who was in the majority. But the dynamics that are unique to local politics in general, and I would argue in particular in the city of Philadelphia, has put us in a situation where we are governed by officials who are elected by a very small sliver of the electorate, and that have stopped focusing on things like, I don't know, picking up the trash during the summer, making sure our streets are safe, and making sure that there is equal opportunity to equal access to opportunity in the pursuit of other aims. And so often when I hear discussions nowadays about the future of our economy, both in a general sense and also with respect to how we move on from the damage that has been done by the pandemic, I often hear these sort of very grandiose notions about making Philadelphia a hub for this industry or that industry, or, I think about the wild goose chase that was trying to get Amazon HQ2 here. And the reality is we have a much more fundamental and a much more profound problem. And that is that, number one, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who live in Haverford Township, don't want to come to the city for dinner anymore because they're terrified. And Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who lives down the street, may be less terrified, but even when they get here, there's nothing open. And even when things do reopen, there will be so much that is no longer here, no longer left. And so we've got to get back to basics. And hopefully throughout this discussion, we can talk about how we get a city government to start listening to job creators, entrepreneurs here at home, and those who are willing to take risks, even when the odds seem insurmountable.
So you're both really looking at jobs and the economy as sort of the underlying number one thing we have to deal with. But to have jobs, you need the businesses. And what business wants to come to this city? Let's look at the taxes. Let's look at what happened by the Art Museum for many, many months today, this past year. Let's look at the riots in the streets. Let's look at so many things. This is not a city that's welcoming business at all. How do we want the jobs, but to have the jobs, we have to create a city that will entice businesses, don't we? Larry?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the most anti-business city council in my memory. Some of the and we are the most taxed city this side of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Not something you want to use in a slogan to advertise your city. So yes, we have to tackle tax reform, which two commissions have laid out a plan, and Paul Levy and Jerry Sweeney had a terrific plan that fell short of getting the political support, which was to start tax. It sounds so elemental, to start taxing what cannot move. We're taxing people, and they can move. So that is a given. Like we need to do that. We also, when we're talking about the pandemic, we need a plan in the short term for just relief, for saying to people, we understand your pain and we need to get you out of this crisis, and then worry about growth. So there are cities that are doing this. I mean, Austin, Texas passed is doing this pilot program. Remember in the 1930s, FDR's civilian, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, putting millions of people who were unemployed because of the Depression to work planting trees and so forth. Austin, Texas is doing that with people who are unemployed. Brilliant idea, right? But there isn't that sort of elasticity of imagination here. Washington, D.C. didn't wait for the federal government. They delivered stimulus checks to 20,000 residents who were unemployed and needed, $1,100 just to get through. And I think Tracy touched on this. Terry touched on this. We don't have a government that sees itself as in the customer service business, and that's a big part of the problem.
Also, if you do something like Austin, isn't labor going to say, no, you can't do that? We have people who can do that.
Well, in this town, probably. But that's where political will comes in, right? And I'm old enough to remember when we had a mayor, Ed Rendell, who stood up to labor and brought the city's status back from junk because of that. So it can be done.
He stood up with them, but also worked with them. He was able to do both simultaneously.
Yeah, that's a thing that's fallen by the wayside is like politics as deal making, right? I remember when Rendell was governor, he made this deal on his first budget with the Republicans in the state legislature, in which he said, if you vote for this, which increased funding like to education by like $300 million, if you vote for this, not only won't I not campaign against you, I will film a commercial for you to talk about how great you were in supporting this budget. Now, can that be done today? I don't think so.
You're probably right. Terry, what do you think in terms of how Philadelphia tries to keep business out when we desperately need it to come in?
Well, I like to think of a very local company that's near and dear to most people's hearts that everybody loves, Wawa. Wawa is a very interesting case study, right? So Wawa left the city probably in the early 2000s. It had shuttered most of its stores, right? And then as the sort of center city, greater center city, Northern Liberty, South Philly Renaissance continued to prosper seemingly in perpetuity, Wawa re-entered the city. In fact, they even opened a flagship store not far from the Union League, right, at Broad and Walnut, which is some of the most expensive commercial real estate in the city. And so Wawa jumps back into the fray, is by all means regarded as a good civic and corporate citizen, right? Employs thousands of people locally. Wawa reopens in the city And then to Larry's point about a city council that is comprised of almost no one who has ever signed the front of a check, outside of a select few, says, well, okay, well, now that you're here, Wawa, we'd like to tell you who you're going to hire and how you're going to hire and what you're going to pay and how you're going to schedule and who gets promoted, right? And so on and so forth. And Wawa says, well, this is aggravating, but we believe in the city. This is our hometown, and we're going to stick it out. Wawa asks for very little in return. Would the city consider tax reform to offset some of the financial burden? The city declines. But might the city consider respectfully relocating the homeless and panhandlers outside of their door to someplace safer for them and safer for their customers, so customers can enter the store without feeling uncomfortable, and the folks outside of the store that need help get the help that they need? There are plenty of city services to that effect, right? The city declines. Might the city consider sharing metrics it uses to arbitrarily shut down the economy, right? Just so that Wawa can plan inventory purchases and payroll costs and forecast the impacts. It's not a debate over whether or not the economy should be shut down or what measures should be taken to flatten the curve. It's just, hey, can you help us understand exactly what goes into the algorithm so that we might be good partners and plan accordingly and understand how to take care of our employees? The city declines. There are riots throughout the streets. Wawa's storefront is broken. The buildings are burned. There's violence all around, irrespective of the legitimacy of the genesis of those riots. Private property, right? And that property, which was along some of our most critical commercial corridors, was left completely unprotected. The city declined to protect Wawa. Now Wawa declined to stay. And that's a shame, not just for the city, and it's a shame for the city. In fact, as I was walking from my car into this building, someone walked up to me and asked, hey, where'd the Wawa go? Which is what made me think about this when I was coming in at Broad and Walnut. And, but it's mostly a shame for the dozens, scores, hundreds of people that had jobs with a company that offered a lot of opportunity and is no longer here as a result of the attitude that this city government has towards businesses, frankly, big and small.
It's really amazing to me that government doesn't understand that, at least government in Philadelphia. You mentioned some of those folks who were outside the doors of Wawa, and we, as I alluded to before, we saw a city grow up near the Art Museum of the homeless. The homeless issue has been part of Philadelphia for a long time, and for a while there, under Ed Rendell, among others, that was really dealt with. It was looked at, it was thought about, and it was dealt with in some very positive ways. We're back to where we were back in the early 80s, as far as I can tell, with the homeless issue, other social issues as well. And where are we on that? I mean, does that come into play? Because that goes along with keeping the streets clean of garbage. It goes along with the whole thing. Let's make this a city that looks good, that people will want to come to, not to say that we shouldn't also take care of the homeless, because I am a strong believer that we haven't done a good job with that recently in this city. What should we be doing on those social issues to try to make the city better? Larry?
Well, I think you're exactly right that we're sort of back in time. It's like Back to the Future, right? We just had, you just reminded me when talking about the reemergence of the epidemic of homelessness. We just posted homicide numbers that we haven't seen since 1990, and there seems to be very little outrage about that. What's the plan? We don't see a plan. Other cities, including just across the river, Camden, has seen an explosive decrease in those numbers of violent crime. So what are they doing that we're not doing? I've reached the point where I have very low expectations for city government, and I'm looking at other cities and that are not waiting for leadership from City Hall. Anchor institutions are stepping up and working together. Take Pittsburgh. there's a we had the executive director of this at the Ideas We Steal Festival. It's called the Allegheny Conference, which is a consortium of business leaders, civic leaders, nonprofits. The mayor's part of it, but it's not the mayor's, and it's not city governments. And they just wrote a 10-year vision for the region, and all of the stakeholders are together. So Terry's analysis about city government is absolutely right, and we can spend all night belly aching about it, which Terry and I have spent numerous nights doing. But I also don't want to let the business community off, because too often the business community in Philadelphia has complained but not acted, and in concert with other nonprofits, major nonprofits, who everything seems to be siloed. And I'm of the view that we need, like an Allegheny Conference, we need an entity, an institution that brings new blood to the problem-solving table.
What do you think about that, Terry?
I mean, I think Larry's right. But then look at the experience of Mark Vettry just this past year, right? Mark spoke up and said, look, I have some real concerns about how this is being handled. He wasn't listened to. There was no platform for him to be heard, or for his analysis or assessment to be adjudicated. And then, you could tell that he was getting increasingly frustrated with the arbitrary nature of seemingly the policy decisions that were made. And then I think it was the Inquirer editorial that in their villains and heroes of 2020, villain number 1 or 2, I think, after Donald Trump, was Mark Vettry. And so you're right, Larry, where is the business community here? But this is a prime example of someone who has built a very successful business, who is well known and well regarded in the community, who has given back to the community, who dares to question, right, the efficacy or the wisdom of city government. And it's amazing to not just watch the blowback from the government, but establishment media and other folks who consider themselves to be sort of on the more progressive front, dismiss him outright. And so, you have this dynamic where the socio-political context has become so illiberal, not progressive, illiberal, right? Where you can't even speak up and ask a question, that you now have, and you sort of compound that with the cancel culture that has, gone viral across the entire country. And you have businesses, rightfully or wrongfully, business owners who are afraid to speak up, because they are already operating on such slim margins, right? They are already just figuring out how to keep the lights on. And then the idea that they have to go quite literally fight City Hall and an establishment press that is ideologically sympathetic, seemingly, to anything that City Hall or the district attorney's office does. And at what point do you throw up your hands, right? And so I think Larry's right. I think, there is a broader crisis of institutions in this country, mediating institutions, right? And I think rediscovering and redefining localism is key to being able to help to, whether that's restore the relevance of previous institutions or create new ones, to Larry's point, in order to address these challenges in a sort of multi-organizational way that has network effects. That's great. And I think part of the reason why we're having this conversation, and quite frankly, part of the reason why the Philadelphia Citizen and Broad and Liberty exists today, is because of that dynamic. But I think, the first step in any recovery is acknowledging that's a dynamic with which we are confronted.
Who's going to lead this?
Larry, I'm kicking that one to you.
Well, that is, I think, the issue facing Philadelphia. We don't have, and we haven't nourished a leadership class. I'm worried that we're rightfully so, but that we're sounding very down. And the one thing that I actually am excited about is a next generation of leadership in the city. Millennials get maligned all the times, but there is a level of young leaders in this city that, if the keepers of the establishment would just make way, I think we will see some things get done. I think there's a young generation of leadership who doesn't know what it doesn't know about the sclerotic nature of Philadelphia these last few years, and that can be liberating. And I'll just give you one example. I'm really impressed with Omar Woodard of the Greenlight Fund. They're investing in smart, data-driven, innovative ways to combat poverty. It's still a drop in the bucket, but here's a young guy from North Philly who's making a difference. We need more of that, and we need not to eat our young as we have so often in the city.
Yeah.
And you know, I'd like to pick up on this topic from a slightly different angle, and frankly, something that Larry and I have lamented over for many years, which is the lack of ideological balance in our public discourse and public policy making processes, and also the lack of competitive elections, right? So, and frankly, just a lack of choice with respect to not just candidates, but a policy response to the crises that in which we are confronted, or an agenda which people can sort of compare and contrast and discern as to which way is the best way forward. And I think this is where, you know, as the leader of a center-right institution here in a sea of deep blue, I think that conservatives need to acknowledge that we have ceded the battlefield in the urban policy context for far too long. The sort of freedom movement or liberty movement, however you'd like to sort of subscribe yourself to it, to speak about it in a broader context, really hasn't had an urban ideological disposition since, you know, maybe Rockefeller Republicanism, Jack Kemp, right? And the reality is that the policy landscape has changed so dramatically over the last 5 years, let alone the last 15 or 50 years, that you're not even showing up to the fight with the requisite political capital to be able to make the case. And so you wind up sending candidates out there who run into a buzzsaw, right? Or you're screaming for oxygen and sort of a fair and balanced coverage in the press. But if you're not showing up to make the case, then how can you expect it to happen? Nobody is going to do the work for you. And it's been all too convenient for, I would argue, conservative politicians to use big cities as political punching bags, right? Rather than figure out how to be part of the solution. And if there was ever a clarion call for the movement to get its act together with respect to this, it's watching our cultural and commercial centers being burnt to the ground, right? This is no longer about politics. There is an urgent moral and civic need for conservatives to show up to this fight and offer solutions and offer an alternative. And it's not that there are not examples out there. I think, you know, Larry is typically very effective at sort of picking out or demonstrating the policy solutions, innovative policy solutions that other towns have pursued. And so, you know, at the end of the day, I think essential to having good leadership is having accountability. And something that is inherent to accountability is the electoral process and the sort of civic and policy debate. And if one side doesn't show up to offer an alternative, then you're going to get what we've got.
How do we let people know what their options are? I don't know what the percentage is of people who voted in the last election, but I'm betting in Philadelphia, even though it was a big election, that it wasn't huge. More people need to be involved, and those people who are involved need to be educated. We don't seem to be doing a good job with that either. Larry, is there a way for us to make that difference?
Well, first of all, the turnout in this last election was, by historic measures, historic. I mean, I think we were at 62%. It is a tragedy, though, that we're high-fiving over 62% turnout. I remember when Michael Nutter ran for re-election. So it was a foregone conclusion because of, as Terry just talked about, there is no real Republican Party offering competitive elections. Turnout was 11%. That is the death of democracy, right? I mean, Terry's right. I like talk to mayors and city council people in other cities all the time. I'm always looking for like who's doing what in an innovative way. And I have to say, like, there are great examples out there. Like I said before, cities have become laboratories for innovation, but they all have competitive elections. Here, we have a Republican Party that long ago made a deal under the Meehan's to not compete in exchange for the crumbs of patronage. Like, let's just be clear about what happened. And that has been the case for decades. And the result is a low information electorate that is numbed into apathy. And part of that numbing into apathy is done by the media, which, and mea culpa on this, right? That doesn't seek to elucidate so much as to just find stories of tension and scandal. There are plenty of scandals in Philadelphia. I talk about them all the time. But if that's all you do, what you're actually doing is deadening the electorate to this pox on all their houses mindset, and you get what we've gotten, which is non-participation.
I always worry about the amount of money that slushes through as well. In Pennsylvania, I think that you can give a whole lot more money as an individual than in most other states. And that sort of thing really changes the dynamic. I mean, if you're the party in power, you get to raise the money and you get to keep yourself there. How do we get around this, Terry?
Well, and I think, Diane, the other thing that concerns me with respect to that issue, and I'll go back to an earlier point that I made, which is the influx of national money in local elections, right? So I know that obviously Pennsylvania was a critical state this year, and turnout in the city, in the presidential election, turnout in the city and the surrounding suburbs was essential for Democrats to recapture the White House. And the number of sort of progressive political action committees that were spending money that is sort of astronomical in a historical context to drive turnout is really telling about how national parties and national organizations are viewing the opportunities with respect to local elections. In fact, I mean, I know George Soros has become the boogeyman, but the reality is he poured a lot of money into a district attorney's race, right? That obviously influenced the outcome. And because of the nature of electoral dynamics in the city of Philadelphia, you had a lot of folks like to bellyache about what's going on in the district attorney's office. But the reality is our current district attorney was really elected by 8 to 10% of the Philadelphia electorate, right? Because that's all that was required to win the Democratic primary. And then we just discussed the issue with respect to the Republican Party, and it was game over. And now we have a website, the district attorney's website, that states, since taking office in January 2018, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office has worked to reduce excessive jail and supervision so we can shift those resources to achieve more effective crime prevention and a just society. And this experiment in decarceration has resulted in a murder rate that has skyrocketed. 2014, 248 homicides, 15, 280, 16, 277, 17, 315, 18, 353, 19, 356, 2020, 499, which by the way was reduced from 502 at the last minute of the last hour of the last day of the year. And so the reality is when you see this kind of national money that is being poured into local elections by organizations like the Progressive Prosecutors Project in pursuit of sort of these grandiose ideological aims without being connected to the local dynamics and policy outcomes. And frankly, when you think about it, you can kind of buy these row offices and these municipal offices for a song when you put it in the context of what gets spent at the national level, and look at the kind of change that can be affected. And in this case, because of that disconnect, and because what I would argue are pretty profound flaws in the way we select our leaders, the results are 499 murders in 2020.
Do we have a real shot at making some changes there? What do you think, Terry?
I'm sorry, Diane, was that for me?
Yeah, do you think we have a real shot at making a change in all of that? I mean, clearly that's extremely important as we look at how are we going to bring the city back?
I do. I mean, I think you're already seeing very some credible folks emerge in the Democratic primary. Carlos Vega, who ran, I believe, the Violent Crimes Unit, has already declared his candidacy in the Democratic primary and said, look, the police are doing their job. We're just not prosecuting the folks who are being brought to us. Broad and Liberty recently published both an op-ed and a joint news story with Delaware Valley Journal on the mother of Zamar Jones, a 7-year-old boy who was murdered a few months ago by an individual who was released on parole despite, or I should say, because of a reduced charges, despite a pretty checkered past. And Ms. Lee came out and said, you know, I supported Larry Krasner. I support criminal justice reform. I am sympathetic to his message that there is something profoundly broken in communities of color and we need to do something different. But this is not what I signed up for. This is not what we signed up for. And, you know, I don't want to put words in Ms. Lee's mouth, but it's heartbreaking. And as a result, we're seeing blood run through the streets. And I do think, I do think, irrespective of partisan politics, I haven't come across, and Larry, tell me if you have, a lot of folks who are saying this experiment is going well. And so I think, I don't know what the electoral outcome will be, but I am optimistic and I think encouraged that we are going to have a vigorous debate about the overall effectiveness of this. And by the way, one last point that I'd like to make, because we're having a hyper sort of city-centric conversation here, but the impact on the region and the inner ring suburbs of these kinds of policies should not go unnoticed. The Upper Darby Township, for example, which is the 5th largest municipality in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and borders the city's western border, had a 400% increase in homicides this year. That's a problem. And so we need to make sure that we're not just ignoring, or that we don't just think of these things in terms of traditional geographic and political boundaries, but really zoom out and think about what the impact is as a region, and hopefully have a conversation of a region that brings a broader mix of leaders to bear to help solve the problem.
That's very important, because if we just leave it to the people who are in Philadelphia, I'm not sure that there's enough backbone to get this all done. But if you look around at what we have in Delaware and western suburbs of Philadelphia, northern suburbs, and look into New Jersey, you can bring a lot of people to bear. How do we go about that, though? What would you suggest, Larry?
Well, I think there's 20 years ago, there was a big movement towards regionalism. We are, if Philadelphia got its act together with its neighbors, with Delaware County, with Montgomery County, with Bucks County, with South Jersey, you're talking about an economic behemoth that can compete with the region in all kinds of ways. But Jim Kenney recently said he's never had a conversation with anyone in Montgomery, Delaware, or Chester counties. Think about that for a minute. That's just, to me, that's leadership malpractice. So I think that's one thing. Just to go back on the district attorney thing, I'm torn on this often, and I've been a critic of Larry Krasner for a while now, but I am sympathetic with some of the reforms. Like some of the reforms, there is ample evidence were needed. The parole and probation system is a mess. Cash bail often penalizes poverty, and that I was on board with. What I'm not on board with, and this gets to the heart of Terry's critique, is revolving door justice that lets violent felons off with slaps on the wrist so they can then go and torture African-American communities predominantly yet again. And that's what we're seeing in these numbers. And that's what you're seeing in a number of progressive prosecutor states. It's going to be interesting to watch the progressive prosecutor who was just elected in Los Angeles, because unlike, I forget his name, but unlike Krasner and some of the others, there's a guy in Texas who has a tattoo that says not guilty on it. I don't know about you, but I don't want a prosecutor with a not guilty tattoo. But in Los Angeles, the new district attorney is a former cop. He's not someone who sued the police for his entire adult life. He actually understands that the that you have to actually uphold law and order in order to do your job. So for me, the jury's still out, although here in Philadelphia, there are real issues.
You see a lot of those things, however, in a lot of cities, unfortunately. I guess if we also look at where did all of this come from, I look at our education system and wonder, once we stopped teaching civics, I don't know when that was, but we stopped a long time ago. I don't think that kids are graduating high school, those who are indeed graduating, with any knowledge of how the system works, of how they're being impacted by things. How do we go about making sure that the children who are coming up, whether they're coming up from private schools or from our public school system, no matter whether they're in poverty or not, how do we make sure that they know how they can help themselves and their city? Kerry?
I mean, I think, again, not to beat a dead horse, but I think that's another key reason why our politics has become so nationalized, right? Because there's a lack of understanding about the federal system and what level of government is responsible for carrying out which tasks. And so when you say, well, we should really hold these leaders accountable, well, do you even understand what that leader is chartered to do or what that government is chartered to do? We could have a session like this in perpetuity over the condition of the Philadelphia school district and how to fix that. I do think, Diane, you're right. At minimum, the reintroduction of meaningful civics, mandated civics, as some states have pursued, is a worthy pursuit. But I think the reality is that we need to meet younger folks where they're at. And I think it's, for the moment, in terms of what are the things that we can do today that are tangible and actionable and can move the needle, frankly, I think it's incumbent upon it requires a third sector solution. I think it requires organizations like the Philadelphia Citizen and Broad and Liberty who are showing up in their social feeds to make the case. That means we have to make the headlines as interesting and sexy as possible. And maybe that's why Larry has that bright pink that everybody loves. So you can't help but click on it. But once you grab them, once you have them, you have 30 seconds, you have 10 seconds before another Facebook push or Twitter notification comes up to make the case that you should read this and this is why it matters. And I know that's what Broad and Liberty is about. We're out there making a case that we can, by improving our civic dialogue, by encouraging intellectual diversity, political diversity, diversity of perspectives, that we can also improve outcomes. And it's small, but it's a starting point.
So we have some questions that have come to us from folks who are watching us. One that really comes to the heart of things is, what must happen for a turning point to occur? I hesitate to think what that might be. Larry?
Well, as someone who is a bit of a public policy geek, right, I'd like to sit here and pretend like we can engineer success. But the reality is that there is a bit of randomness to these sorts of things as well, right? I'm reminded of economist Enrico Moretti in his book, The New Geography of Jobs, had a chapter on innovative job clusters. And Seattle is always held up as this, great city that's innovative in creating jobs and home to these great corporations. That the reality is there was sort of a randomness to how it happened, right? Like, I don't think Sam Walton, when he opened his first variety store, was like, you know what? Bentonville, Arkansas is going to be the next Midtown Manhattan. And that's why Walmart and Sam's Club is going to be based here. I don't think Kevin Plank, who's the co-founder and CEO of Under Armour, was like, Baltimore really has their public policy making act together. I'm going to go put a headquarters in the Inner Harbor. There were other circumstances. It was their hometown. They loved the city. They were invested in its success. There was some other sort of random reason why that came to be. And so if there's one thing the city can do that is well within its control, it is to listen to those people that are creating incremental economic output, that are creating jobs, that are taking risks in a terrible dynamic in a city that does not love them back, Diane, as you put at the beginning of the program, and listen to them. How can we make you successful? What are the roadblocks? What do you need? In fact, I would argue that the city should pass an ordinance that requires an entrepreneurial impact assessment or statement for any legislation that is passed that has a direct impact on businesses 5 years or younger. what are the direct and indirect costs associated with passing this legislation? There's something we could do tomorrow. And that doesn't mean the legislation gets passed. It means that the perspective gets heard, right? And then next thing you know, Kevin Plank of Philadelphia is able to prosper and grow.
I'm going to go to you in a second, Larry, but I wanted to read this. Someone asked this question. Mayor Kennedy disagrees strongly with what we're saying, that Philadelphia is not competitive. And this person gave us a quote from last year's chamber breakfast, quote, "Companies, including those who have the power and the money to be anywhere in the world, are investing in Philadelphia like never before. I can think of no place better for businesses." Question, does he really believe this?
Well, I can't believe he does, because there is no evidence for it. I mean, look at Paul Levy's research at the Center City District that compares us to peer cities. We have more jobs leaving the city than any peer city, and the jobs that we have created, and we have had a modest jump in jobs, but they're the wrong kind of jobs. They're jobs below $35,000 a year. Boston is jobs 85,000 and above. So that is what is commonly referred to in the political circles as spin or BS. The other question about catalyst made me think of when I was living in New York in the late 80s, New York City, which was not safe then. And a family from Iowa came in for the US Open and took the subway. And it was a son and his parents, and they got mugged. And the son, in trying to protect his parents, was knifed and murdered. And this isn't me saying this, it was seen as this catalyst to change in New York. And pretty soon you had broken windows policing, you had Bill Bratton, you had, for better or worse, at the time, it was better, now it's worse. You had Rudy Giuliani. And you saw New York become the safest big city like in the history of America up until a year ago. And that was one event that caught the imagination and spark of the populace and sparked change. And that's possible here. My hope is that maybe the looting and the riots this in 2020 could be that, but that requires the political will to make the change that is demonstrably needed.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, this is the same mayor that just a couple of weeks ago said, "I don't know what everybody's complaining about. The city's open for business. Every restaurant can do takeout, and every gym can do at-home digital workouts." The mayor needs to walk home, right? Because anybody who walks through the city's core right now and makes a comment like the city is open for business and remembers just at the beginning of his administration, I mean, even controlling for COVID to some extent, what this city was, there is just a level of cognitive dissonance there that is startling. And quite frankly, it's comments like that that do so much damage to the credibility of our leadership, because your eyes don't lie. And I wish what we were doing was we were having a thoughtful debate about, public policy decision making, and Mr. Mayor, who's at the table, including your public health officials, what economists are at the table, and there's the chamber at the table, and how are we coming to it? But these sort of shoot from the hip, condescending, completely detached from reality, but said as if they are 100% true, and then inform how we govern by fiat. And you wonder why, whatever the number is, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% of people check out. And you wonder why we have such a crisis of sort of leadership, generally speaking. I mean, think about it. We, as a nation, we are on the cusp of one of the great achievements of the modern era, right? A massive success of public-private partnerships. We have produced a vaccine in record time, in less than a year, right? To the deadliest pandemic in over a century. We should be spiking the ball in the end zone over what a success that is. And yet we have significant portions of the population that reject the efficacy, the motivations, the effectiveness, whatever, of the vaccine outright because they don't believe what their leaders are telling them. And similarly, the Pennsylvania Health Secretary had held a press conference recently where a similar series of questions was asked. Well, so what are the metrics that are going to get us out of this? What are you guys looking for? How do you define herd immunity? And the answer is effectively, I don't know. Broad and Liberty called the mayor's office. We said, please what we would like to do is we would like to inform the public as to how the algorithm is created. What are you looking at? We'll let you know. We'll get back to you. It's just a failure of leadership. And until that gets fixed, it will be very difficult to turn the corner.
I would agree with that. We have another question. If we need tax reform to attract businesses and jobs, and city council is anti-business, how can we get tax reform?
Well, one way we get it is by being engaged. It is, when, in my experience, when business leaders get engaged in trying to change the playing field of Center City from policy, the city from a policy standpoint, they're surprised actually by how easy it is to move the ball, because it doesn't take that much in terms of contributions to get action, especially with a council that has at least some members who have really no core convictions whatsoever. There is the possibility for change, and we've seen it in, there are green shoots of encouragement every once in a while, but I would say that it's never too late to get engaged and to let your voice be heard. In a corrupt one-party town, you get what you put into it, right? So many of us bemoan the Groundhog Day nature of politics in the city, but that's because too many of us have complained, but too few of us have rolled up our sleeves.
One lever we may have to pull is PICA. We believe it or not, it still exists, right? The city has effectively been in a sort of special status, first city of the first class receivership or state oversight mechanism since 1991, I believe. It's become largely a ceremonial board at this point. It rubber stamps the city's 5-year financial plan. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say most folks look at most 5-year financial plans and say they don't pass the smell test, right? That it's going to be very difficult. And in fairness, it's very difficult to project what 5 years might as well be 500 years in this environment, right? But when you think about our spending per capita, which is in the top 5 in the country, when you think about our debt per capita, which is 3rd highest in the country, maybe PICA needs to take a second look about what the city's fiscal plans are and how it intends to drive growth, balance its budget, provide the requisite level of services for a population that is unfortunately too poor, and use that mechanism to start to bring folks around the table again, to start having a serious conversation about what we need to do to begin kicking the tires on meaningful tax reform efforts. And I echo Larry. I think the Levy-Sweeney plan is a great place to start. There's been a lot of change since it was at the top of the agenda, but it's a great framework to start. And I think PICA might be a useful tool if folks in Harrisburg had the political will to lean on the PICA board to bring people around the table and have a serious conversation.
All right, I'd like to ask one last question of each of you. And that is, we've talked a lot about the negatives, and Larry, you pointed that out. Let's look at the positives. What can we achieve? What difference can we really make? And how can we do that, let's say in the next year? What would you see as a positive glass half full view of the city coming back? Let's start with you, Larry.
Well, I would like to see two things. The city, first of all, have a plan. I mean, that's very rudimentary, but let's have an economic growth plan. In other cities, Chicago, for example, Mayor Lori Lightfoot owned the city's plan. She got leaders together. They came out with a 104-page plan for how to handle the pandemic and afterwards and how to regrow the economy. And they committed, that task force did, to quarterly updates before the citizenry until the year 2023. Here, the Chamber of Commerce came out with a plan that had some good things in it, but it was not the mayor's plan. He endorsed it, but he had nothing to do with actually doing it. And it was more general than the Chicago plan. So I'd like to see a plan. And I think there are areas that I think you could easily embark upon a Marshall Plan to take on economic inequality in Philadelphia, a Marshall Plan for African-American entrepreneurship in neighborhoods. That requires freeing up capital, venture capital, patient capital, to go into those neighborhoods, and where entrepreneurs don't have access to capital that many others do. And then finally, the thing that is a natural for Philadelphia is to be ground zero in the business for good category. This is the birthplace of the B Corp. Corporations that define themselves as serving stakeholders, not just shareholders. There's a nonprofit here, B Lab, which created the whole thing. We should own that. And Philadelphia already does have more B Corps than any city per capita, but you don't see a marketing campaign about that. And that's a way to also address economic inequality.
Terry?
One of the things that's sort of unique to Pennsylvania political culture is that, because of where we're situated geographically, our history is such that we have sort of all of the very parochial dynamics of New England sort of governance history, right? And then sort of these county dynamics that are more typical to what you see in southern states. And so what you wind up with is this hybrid where you have all these county governments stacked on top of all of these municipal governments with a big city government, and then you have the state coming in and having some of these, organizations like PICA and Act 47 for distressed municipalities, and you just have this really convoluted approach to governance in the area. And I think the net result is but almost through the fault of no one, a severe sort of misallocation of resources, right? It's not that we don't have the capital to affect change. It's not that we don't spend the capital to affect change. It's that where we spend it and how we spend it does not ultimately result in change. And so I am a huge proponent of exploring regional governance opportunities. I think the city of Toronto, which did a consolidation about 20 years ago, and as a result, it might even be longer now, as a result was able to free up all kinds of social capital, real capital to invest in public transit, infrastructure. Going back to Larry's point about the Marshall Plan, you sort of civic Marshall Plan, there's merit to it. But if it's in the hands of government alone, and it's purely a tax and spend approach, the net result will be very little change gets affected. So I think that there's really an opportunity for a sort of multi-level, multi-organizational, bipartisan approach to say, how and where are we spending public capital and to what effect? What is the social change? And if you do that kind of analysis with the right people around the table, I think you'd find some low-hanging fruit pretty quickly.
Well, Terry and Larry, thank you so much for giving us some really great information. And in the end, showing us that maybe there is a way that we can make Philadelphia that wonderful city that loves us back. It needs that magic again. Thank you so much. John?
Amen, Diane. And thank you, Diane, Terry, Larry, great program. Really interesting. I am still optimistic, and I think we all should be. This is a great city. It's the city that we do love. And it is up to us. Diane, you've been at Good Citizen Day many years. One of the things that we preach to our high school juniors, one of the most important things is not just to know stuff, not just to, but to do it, to be involved citizens. And so I encourage everyone to do that. And Larry and Terry, keep doing what you guys are doing. It's good stuff. It's vitally important. And Diane, again, thank you so much for being our moderator this evening.
Loved it.
So that's our program tonight. We have two more programs in January. One next Wednesday, which is a library hour with Andrew Heath. And then we have a Civil War Roundtable on January 27th. And we have our annual Lincoln Day festivities on February 12th. The bad news is we are going to be doing it virtually, so we won't have any festivities at the Union League. The good news is that it's virtual, so everyone can attend from anywhere that they can get onto Zoom or YouTube. So we'll send out information to everyone in the next few days about Lincoln Day. And until next week's library hour, good evening and thank you for being with us.